Good morning. Good to see you all here today. Let's open in our Bibles to 1 Corinthians chapter 7. Spent a couple weeks on this chapter, and I know it's one that we all have a lot of thoughts and questions, and it's a very difficult chapter, which we've gone over the reasons why it's a challenging chapter. But hopefully we'll wrap it up in a few minutes here and move on into chapter 8. And this next section is going to be a pretty big unit of thought. Now, we have chapter divisions, and oftentimes it's best to just ignore those chapter divisions. And I'll suggest to you chapters 8, 9, and 10 is best thought of as one unit of thought where Paul is addressing the same question throughout. So hopefully in just a short order we'll begin chapter 8, but we'll wrap up a little bit of chapter 7. We're going to pick up, we'll pick up probably about verse 35 or verse 36 and finish those last couple verses of chapter 7 here in just a moment. Before we get into the text, though, I'd like to begin with a word of prayer, and I'd ask you to bow with me at this time as we begin the Lord's Day with our thoughts directed towards our God in heaven. Our wonderful and awesome Father, our great King, almighty, exalted, reigning over all the earth, we come to you now at the beginning of this day, set and determined to focus on you, to push out all thoughts of the world, and in determination to evaluate our lives through the lens of the Bible that is open before us. We thank you for preserving over thousands of years the stories and lessons that mankind has had to learn about you, sometimes through difficulty and through challenge. We're grateful that the Bible has stood the test of time and remains true to this day, that we can confidently turn through these pages and know that what we're reading is, a revelation of your very nature and your very will. We thank you for keeping it for us, and we ask for your blessings as we study and as we seek to understand you just a little bit better today. Please be with each teacher in their Bible class and with the students. They would have a good experience this morning, free of distraction and able to learn some things that will set them on a good path for the rest of their life. This we pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, so in chapter 7, when we get to this back half of the chapter, beginning in verse 25, and again, I'll point out to you that now we're in the part of the letter where Paul is dealing with now concerning. Now concerning, here's questions you have submitted, here's questions that they had asked about, and so now Paul is addressing their questions. And verse 25, I'll just remind you, without going back over this text, that there is a little bit of a difference. What are the two possible and likely interpretations of verse 25? Now concerning which category of people, what are the two likely scenarios we're talking about? And it depends on probably which English Bible you have in front of you. Concerning blank or blank. Who could it be? Virgins. So it could be concerning those who have never been married, and just kind of a blanket statement concerning all virgins, all people that have never been married before. What is the other scenario that isn't drastically different, but maybe adds a little bit of nuance to it that some translations suggest besides virgin? Betrothed. That's who we're looking at. The English Standard Version, namely, is the one that identifies betrothed. And so there's a lot of overlap between the idea of virgin or betrothed, but betrothed will add a little bit of nuance to it with regard to you're unmarried and never have been married, but you are in a situation where you are already linked to someone, and from a somewhat legal standpoint. We think about Mary and Joseph. So that's kind of my take on it, but I don't want to say, as with much of this chapter, that just because that's what I lean towards, that's not me saying that's how you have to understand it. Gil?
When you compare the two, betrothed, virgin, the difference is simply a virgin female was still under the command or the rule of her father.
Yeah.
She was a part of his home. And he made whatever decision. A betrothed, on the other hand, had already gone through the legal process
Yeah.
That was Mary and Joseph.
Right.
Joseph had control over Mary, which is why he could have put her away.
Yeah, the decision was in Joseph's hands at that point. And you talked about this last week, the legal side of it too. And oftentimes that included the dowry, a payment being made. And so that's really the only major difference in how virgin versus betrothed might affect the way you interpret this chapter. Let's look at our text. Verse 36. Now, again, the last couple verses, Paul was just talking about why, under these present circumstances, which is one of, I think, the biggest complications with trying to figure out this chapter and apply it to us today, they had a particular circumstance, a present distress that flavored everything Paul was saying throughout this chapter. And that does add a layer of difficulty. And he's just explaining that because of this present distress, you're better off being single, because if you're married, you're not just concerned with things of the Lord, you're concerned with things of the world. A husband taking care of his wife and children, a wife, how she may please her husband. And so you've got those other factors when your faith is being put to the fire, is really being put to the test here. So that's what he had been talking about up to this. But verse 36, he comes back to this idea of, I think, the betrothed, but verse 36 is a good way to kind of show how these two ideas add a little variance. But if any man thinks he is behaving improperly toward his virgin, if she is past the flower of youth, and thus it must be, let him do what he wishes. He does not sin, let them marry. So if we're talking about virgins, I think the emphasis would be on a father. As a father, do you give your daughter away in marriage or not? So if virgin is the word we're looking at, I think that's the emphasis here. And that's where it gets a little odd to me in verse 36. If any man thinks he is behaving improperly toward his virgin, are we talking about a father to his daughter? That certainly makes me a little bit uncomfortable. But if we're talking about the scenario of betrothed, you have been betrothed to this woman, and if there's some concern about behaving improperly, if she's of the proper age, let him do what he wishes. And that comes back to what he said at the beginning of the chapter. Don't think celibacy is better if you're going to burn with passion, or I'm adding in the idea of passion, but the idea of better to marry than to burn. Paul sort of addressed this idea already. So that's where it makes a little more sense to me to think about the betrothal scenario here, that if you're in this arrangement, you are already hitched to this person legally, but you're thinking, Paul said it's better if I don't have a wife. Should I follow through and finish the marriage ceremony and be joined together and consummate the marriage and all that and live as husband and wife, or should I remain single? And Paul says, you're not sinning if you choose to go through with the marriage. That makes a bit more sense to me than thinking about the relationship of a father giving his daughter away in marriage. But again, either one is possible. Isabel? Yeah, so the NIV adds toward his virgin that he is engaged to. So the NIV, and they're not, that shouldn't be too shocking to us. They're not adding to the Bible. That is an earnest intention of translating it properly. So translation is just not 1 + 1 = 2. It's never quite that simple, and some passages are a bit more challenging than others, because languages, one language to another, can be very different, especially when there's a 2,000-year time jump. So that is why some versions like the NIV have sort of filled in that blank, and they more strongly interpret it as betrothed. All right, any questions, comments about that in verse 36? Again, that's what Paul has been saying throughout this whole chapter. It's better if you don't marry, but don't feel like you've sinned. Or if you are married, don't unmarry yourself. Don't live celibate if you are married. That's not a better or more spiritually enlightened way of life. So if you marry, Paul's saying, I'm not telling you that's sinful or wrong. You're fine to do it, but maybe you're just better off right now under these circumstances not. Robert?
There's a note, at least in the New King James Version,
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
Read it that way. But the other thing is, thinking back to Song of Solomon, where the woman was burning with passion, wanting to move forward, but she has a bridesmaid helping her calm down, bring herself through and maintain her.
Well, and some of that depends on if you look at Song of Solomon as a love story or as a love triangle. But if it is a love triangle, that's kind of my take. Regard to her shepherd boy back home, she does have a desire to be with them, and so that is a good comparison here. So some translations will add the footnote virgin daughter. Some translations will add the footnote virgin you are betrothed to, and I'm not going to settle the debate and tell you, like, I barely speak English fluently, okay? So I am not going to settle the debate for you here this morning. I just want to show you how both are possible, and I think the context is leaning towards betrothal, but I'll certainly let you make your determination about that. And verse 37 seems to support this idea of, again, if you can handle this setup and being single, and you're not already married seeking to get out of your marriage, if you're single and you can handle being single, you have that self-control, that's good. Nevertheless, he who stands steadfast in his heart, having no necessity, but has power over his own will, and has so determined in his heart that he will keep his virgin, does well. So it's you do well if you marry, you do well if you keep her as a virgin, whether that's the father choosing not to give his daughter in marriage or the betrothed choosing to remain betrothed but not actually living together as husband and wife and not completing that arranged marriage yet. Brady?
It's like a segue into liberty.
Yeah.
Foreshadowing that, like, you have the liberty, do this, do that.
Yeah, chapters 8, 9, and 10 is going to talk about some liberties and how to use them properly versus improperly. So it is sort of a segue into the next now concerning section. Yeah, and Paul often does that. There's some natural connections from one chapter to another, even though taking a step back, it certainly looks like a couple dozen disjointed and disconnected grievances that Paul has with them and several questions that are unrelated to each other, but you can see why Paul put them in the order he did as he wrote this, or rather dictated it to his scribe. Gil?
Looking at the two sides, betrothed or virgin still in the father's home. Verse 37 tends to lend itself to the virgin still in the father's home. He has the authority. If she were betrothed, would not.
Yeah, so I think there are solid arguments, and that's why I said I slightly lean towards one, but I am by no means going to say it's a slam dunk, because there's pretty solid evidence on that side as well. Verse 37 does in many ways lend itself to the father having a virgin daughter in his home, still having authority over her. So that is, again, a very possible interpretation of this text as well. Yeah. And maybe it's a little bit of both. Maybe it applies to both sides of the scenario, that if you are betrothed, if you're the betrothed daughter, if you're the father, if you're a man betrothed to a woman, maybe it covers all three of those scenarios. And
It's more of a general concept.
well, and again, the general principle applies to any of those scenarios. Given marriage, you give your daughter in marriage, you haven't done her wrong. You've maybe added some difficulties to her life, but you haven't made her sinful or made her less spiritual by putting her into a marriage with another man, with the husband that you've arranged. As the daughter, you're kind of caught between your father and your betrothed, and whatever happens, it's a non-issue as far as sin or salvation is concerned. It just adds some complicating worldly factors. And if you're a man betrothed to a woman, well, you can choose to marry her, or, as he says there, If you have power over your own will and you determine in your heart to keep the arrangement as is, legally bound, but we're going to halt it right there. So you can see how it really, the principle throughout this chapter applies to any one of those scenarios. You can marry, and there's nothing inherently wrong with marriage. There's nothing dirty about marriage or the sexual relationship within marriage. There's nothing inherently superior to being celibate other than the particular circumstances. So I think it applies to all these scenarios. And then the last two verses here, certainly some discussion about what is meant here, but he seems to be talking about widows in these last two verses. And so verse 39 and 40, a wife is bound by law as long as her husband lives, but if her husband dies, she is at liberty to be married to whom she wishes, only in the Lord. But she is happier if she remains as she is, according to my judgment, and I think I also have the Spirit of God. I love that last little phrase by Paul. My judgment, it's an opinion, is my take on that, but I also have the Spirit. I also have the Spirit of God. So I think my opinion is something you shouldn't disregard without due consideration. So, yeah, I'm going to come to that one. Verse 39, a wife is bound, that as long as her husband is living, that is very similar to Romans chapter 7, the first couple verses there, and it just paints a pretty clear picture of what God's intention has always been. The ideal is one man, one woman. What God has joined together, let not man separate. And that has always been the ideal. And so it's just echoed here. But that last part, talking about a widow, she is at liberty to be married to whom she wishes, only in the Lord. Okay. What could that possibly mean? What are some possible interpretations of she's free to marry, her husband's died, so she's not bound to her husband, she is free and clear to marry, but only in the Lord. What do you make of that, only in the Lord? What are some possible takes on that? To be evenly yoked? All right, and that comes, that's a passage in 2 Corinthians we'll get to and sometime down the road, but to be equally yoked, that's a metaphor that's often included here. Yep. Is that a footnote or is that how yours is translated directly? Okay, yeah, so that's a bit of an interpolation, if you will, a translation, but with some interpretation added to it. But that is one possible idea there, is only in the Lord means, well, you marry someone that's in the Lord's body of people. Gil?
Keep it within the context of the verse. The verse is saying, wife is bound, third verse, legally. When the husband dies, that legal binding is all because she's no longer not husband. Peter married only in the Lord, within the confines of authority that God has given. You obey the law.
Yeah, within the confines. So it could be speaking of an authority, not necessarily the people of the Lord, but within the authority of the Lord. Robert?
To me, it's almost like, all of us who are married, we have a contract with, not necessarily a contract, but we get tax breaks, we get all kinds of things because under the law, that's what we get. And everybody, Christian, non-Christian, gets that. If you were married as a non-Christian, and then you become widowed, or widowed as a Christian, then if you were to get married again, then you need to marry not just by the law, by contract, but under, like I said, the confines within the Bible.
Yeah.
Marry someone who's going to understand what God is talking about.
Yeah. So I'll just say this, as with many parts in chapter 7, I feel like If it were a debate, you could put me on either side of the debate, and I could probably make a pretty strong case. Put me on the other team, I could probably make a pretty good case against what I had just made. Like, I could debate myself back and forth on some of these possibilities, and this is one of them. One question, if only in the Lord means only marry another Christian, he's talked about other people earlier in this chapter. To the unmarried, he said, you can get married. Chapter 7, look at verse 8. But to the unmarried and to the widows, it is good for them if they remain even as I am, but if they cannot exercise self-control, let them marry, but only in the Lord. Well, he doesn't add that there. 1 Timothy chapter 5, younger widows, don't support them financially. They ought to get married and bear children only if they marry another Christian. He doesn't add that qualifying statement there either. So there's a lot of places where I have a hard time when there's only, and yeah, it only takes one scripture. I agree to that. But I'm also hesitant in a passage like this that is heavily influenced by the present circumstances to say this one time it is mentioned only in the Lord, to make that a blanket rule that applies across the board. So I have some concerns with saying only in the Lord means only another Christian, but I'm going to come back and defend the other side and say I do think that is something that the Bible does teach. Jay, I'll let you chime in.
We often only stop at 2 Corinthians 6:14. Unequally yoked with unbelievers, but we read on, it says, for what partnership has righteousness with lawlessness? What fellowship has light with darkness? Or what harmony has Christ with Baal? What has a believer in common with an unbeliever? Read through, but very clear what God stands with partnership with wickedness.
Yeah, so don't.
Unbeliever in today's culture, time is kind of different than pure idolatry, temple worship, harlots, and what it was religious and common practice back then.
So would you suggest that this is saying only in the Lord means marry another Christian?
Based on all the conflict that's
Yeah.
resolved.
And so here's where let me come back to the other side of it. So yeah, I've got some pause with making this a blanket absolute rule, but I don't want to dismiss it. The idea of only in the Lord means marry another Christian, because I mean, let's just think about this from a pure logical standpoint. Paul talked about how difficult it's going to be for them, the present distress. And he talks about how, you should only be focused on the Lord, and a single person can focus entirely on the Lord. And when you're married, it adds some other complicating factors. Again, he's not saying marriage is bad or wrong. In many other places, he says you should be married. So under this present circumstance, I'll get to you in just a second, David. Under this present circumstance, would it be wise, if you're going to get married, which is what Paul does not advise you to do anyway, to then, well, I'll get married to an unbeliever, someone that doesn't share my faith. So when my feet are held to the fire and worship Caesar or deny your God, what is my husband or my unbelieving wife, what kind of influence are they going to have on me? So I can see from a logical standpoint, it's hard to say. I certainly wouldn't say that's wise to marry an unbeliever. Or what Paul is saying is good. David, what are your thoughts? Yeah, so we have free will, and that sort of segues into my thoughts on it. Well, okay. Julio, go ahead.
Okay, I am biased to this because I came from the unbelievable side, right? I was no believer when I met my wife. But when I have my kids, I told them we came from a family who was two religions in the beginning. We make a lot of struggles for us as a nuclear family. I think it's important when it says to marry someone in the Lord, is when you are meeting someone, try to found a couple of your you to grow to get to heaven, because that's the most important part.
Yeah.
If you found a person in the church, he can help you to, or they can help you to go to heaven. That's the most important part. If you found someone outside of the church, but it helps you to grow, and you can help her to come back to the church, that's the point to go. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I'm not saying that because if you found someone who is a fully sinner, who is really focused on nothing, like you were saying, if she, in case of my boy, right? If she is someone who is pointing to go outside of the church, to not follow the Lord's laws, then that's no someone in the Lord. No even question of it.
Yeah, someone that is completely against God, and maybe that's sort of what you were getting at, Jay, that an unbeliever today might be someone that believes in the same God, reads the same Bible as you, and has a veneration for the same God, just the same as you, but maybe has a little different denominational take. Now, I still wouldn't say that is preferable, and just because it's worked for Julio doesn't mean that it should work for everyone. And I tell that when I go to summer camp. I get these 16, 17, 18-year-old kids in my cabin and tell them, hey, you 18-year-olds, I was married 1 year after you. I was 19 when I got married. And they're like, whoa, that's so young. I say, yep, it worked for me, 20 years in June, actually. But that doesn't mean I'm recommending it for you guys either. But be thinking, so just because something works for me doesn't mean I always recommend it for others. David, you want to follow up? Yeah. And that comes back to what was said earlier in the chapter about if your unbelieving husband or an unbelieving spouse does not consent to stay married and departs, let him depart. And it says, for who knows, a wife, whether you'll save your husband. And so I'm not sure I would suggest that marrying someone in the hopes that they become a Christian is advisable. So here's where I'll leave off with this, my take on this. I think it's pretty clear that it is good advice to marry another believer, particularly another member of the Lord's body. Now, we've all seen where two people met through church, married, and then both fell away. It's not an absolute. It's not going to guarantee that they keep each other strong. I've seen people where one married an unbeliever against everyone's advice, and kind of like Julio's scenario, it worked out and they became a believer and it was a very happy ending. There are exceptions. And Julio's right, we have free will. So here's where I'll kind of leave this. Well, I can make a pretty strong case that you ought to marry another Christian, another believer. That doesn't mean that if someone is married to an unbeliever and chose that I'm going to disregard their marriage and say, well, that doesn't count because it's not only in the Lord. I don't think that's the right interpretation of this either. So, well, you can make a strong case that it is the best course of action, and there's plenty of scripture. We'll talk about that with the unequally yoked when we get to 2 Corinthians. Like I said, I've got some pause with making this an absolute, like all scenarios applicable rule. And that's what it says in verse 40, it's judgment. Yeah. So it is the advice that Paul is giving based on their present circumstance. We can make some application for us today, but let's not be too dogmatic about it because there are a lot of complicating factors that we've already discussed in this chapter. Robert?
Before we're talking about virgins or people who are under the father's household and direction of the father, because they haven't left their household, they haven't made it under the tent of their husband, but the wife is no longer under her father's home. So Paul, always talking to these people as his churches that he writes to as his children, my little children, is playing the father role.
Mm-hmm.
Saying, look, I'm not your father, but I suggest that you do.
Yeah, he is acting with and he talked about that earlier on. My next visit You can tell me what kind of visit it's going to be. Do you want me to come as a loving father, or do you want me to come bringing the rod of correction? Is this going to be a pleasant or unpleasant visit when I come see you next? So he is talking from a very paternal standpoint, and as parents, we can lead the horses, that is our children, to the water, but we cannot force them to drink it. Is that a good non-answer for you, Brady?
I like verse 40 though. Verse 40 makes me kind of laugh. Because it's very much like Philemon, where he said, oh, there's Philemon,
Yeah.
anything, let me know. By the way, remember you owe me your very self.
Yes.
So he sets it up in a way that gently prods them to kind of do the things probably is the best. And it's really interesting psychology. It's a very good parenting.
Paul has a very subtle humor and sarcasm to his writing. Sometimes it's not so subtle, but he has a great sense of humor that you see sometimes. And I love that example from Philemon. You know, I could ask you as an apostle, I could force you, I could order you to release Onesimus to me, but yeah, I'm not going to. I'm going to appeal to you as Paul, the aged. Help me out.
Is to make it easy for them to do the right thing.
Yeah.
Which is something we should be doing with our children. We'll make it, set it up to help you do what's right. Make it easy. We'll make it powerful. Now, it's not always that way. But I think that's what he kind of did with Philemon and Onesimus.
Yeah. Yeah, he's saying, I don't want to have to spell it out for you. I don't want to have to tell you, like, that I have the Spirit also. My judgment is pretty solid. You should probably listen to me on this one. Oren? Yeah. Right, and that's another factor with why I'm hesitant to make a blanket absolute rule is she should only marry in the Lord. If that means only another Christian, what does that then only apply to because of the present distress? And it's not an absolute across time in all circumstances and situations. So it's just another one of those. There's so much in this chapter that we're trying to do our best to understand what it meant to them and how we can apply it to us. It's a difficult chapter, but not impossible to understand some and derive some basic principles. Celibacy is not some higher spiritual way of living. Marriage does not degrade you. It is not a dirty arrangement because the sexual relationship is part of marriage. So spiritually speaking, you're neither better nor worse if you marry. Those are some principles we can take. If you're married, stay married. That's always been the expectation. And so there are some general principles we can take from this chapter. Mike? Yeah, Paul was told how much he must suffer, and Scott pointed this out to me at the end of class last week. Jeremiah is a good comparison, although the circumstances, his present distress was much, much worse than theirs, I would argue. But God told Jeremiah, don't plan on getting married, don't plan on having kids. It's not in the cards for you, Jeremiah. It's not going to work out. Too much going on, and it's just not going to happen. All right. So that's chapter 7. I'd like to move on now into chapter 8. And let me preface this chapter with some of what we discussed in chapter 7. As far as customs go, I think our first obligation to biblical interpretation is, what did it mean to its original recipients? That is the first obligation in understanding a text. And when we look at 1 Corinthians chapter 7, for example, we need to understand, like with betrothal, if that is what's being considered there, culturally, what did it mean to them versus, marriage is pretty universal across time, but the customs around engagement or betrothal are a little bit different. And so sometimes there's customs that seem a little off to us or different, but not drastically. Sometimes things are completely unchanged across time. When he says, I planted, Apollos watered. Well, gardening has not changed other than adding bigger and better equipment, but the concept hasn't changed at all. We totally get that and understood what it meant to them, and it means the same thing for us today. But when we talk about dining in an idol's temple, that's going to be maybe not the main idea of chapters 8, 9, and 10, but it's at the center of their question and some of the controversy. What does that even mean? I'm trying to find a good cultural correlation to today. Gil?
Paul is writing to the church of Corinth. That church isn't made up solely of displaced Jews, nor is it made up solely of native Gentiles. It's a combination of both.
And that's why I think you get such extremes from, you cannot join yourself to a harlot, chapter 6. No, celibacy is not better, chapter 7. Well, those are pretty big extremes because it's I would guess, a pretty cosmopolitan church.
So I get confused about looking at these things. This point, there is a point, which is why I keep coming back to the concept we just talked about. This idea of God's giving us principles. He wants us to apply those principles. He did the same thing with the Jews. They just didn't get it. That's why Christ says, you've heard it said, don't kill. I'm telling you, don't even call your brother a fool, which is what the Old Testament intended. God's given us principles.
And I think that's maybe our best effort in these chapters, is to look for a principle. Try to understand it as best we can, 2,000 years removed from that time and culture. Try to understand as best we can what it meant to them, then try and understand what can we take away from it. And I think our third obligation, what did it mean to them? Then we work on application for us today. But the third obligation that's sometimes forgotten is, how do I explain this to someone? Understanding it is one thing, but understanding it well enough to put in your own words and explain it to someone else, that is the third and most critical step of biblical interpretation. So chapter 8. Now concerning things offered to idols, and that's an interesting expression there too. Meat sacrificed to idols, things sacrificed to idols. And then the other expression, dining in an idol's temple, becomes a specific part of this. So I think there's the generic question about eating the meat. It was sacrificed to an idol, and I've always kind of understood it to be one thing. I did a little digging, and my research hasn't really changed. I just want to make sure, I've always heard preachers say this throughout my life, that, okay, what are my sources? I went back and looked through some Bible dictionaries and looked up this concept. The Holman Bible Dictionary, for example, I was reading through that just this morning, kind of freshening up on some of these ideas. And it talks about, it's not drastically different from what we see in the temple in Jerusalem, where you take an animal and part of it is offered on an altar, part of it is given to the priests for their food. But one difference is the largest part of it in Corinthian culture or Greco-Roman culture would be, the largest part would be sold in the marketplace or consumed in a meal of thanksgiving to whatever god or deity. Some commentators even suggest it isn't just like to Zeus or Apollo, or it might be that your family ancestors become sort of deified, and the house or the home or the property getting passed down from generation to generation to generation, you get this like almost family shrine, and that could be part of what's in view here. But it seems like the most common idea, and that picture, by the way, you might notice that's different from the ruins in Corinth that I usually have up there on the PowerPoint. That is the ruins from the temple to Asclepius. That's a fun name to say. I think he was the god of healing. His symbol is the one with the two snakes wrapped around. That's what hospitals still have, or ambulances still have on them. So there were temples and shrines to Asclepius, and here's the ruins of one in ancient Corinth. And you can actually find diagrams where people sort of filled in the blanks and reconstructed what it would have looked like. And there were some massive dining rooms where these feasts would happen. And so you have the temple to Apollo, things like that would happen there, the temple to Zeus. So that's sort of what's going on there. And this isn't the only place. So there's the generic question, eating meat sacrificed to an idol. But a more specific, related question is, what about in an idol's temple? So those questions overlap, but keep in mind the generic question in verse 1 concerning things offered to idols. That's a pretty broad question, and he's going to talk about specific applications and specific scenarios here. Now, this isn't the only part of the Bible that talks about it. Go back to Acts chapter 15 for just a moment. In Acts chapter 15, you've got, as we call it, the Jerusalem Conference. There's questions about, what about the Jews that are following us around and insisting that Gentiles keep the customs of Moses and things like that. And it was a big debate amongst the apostles and the elders in Jerusalem, and Paul and Barnabas came there sort of speaking up for the Gentiles. And so among the conclusions they came to in Acts chapter 15, look at verse 20, first of all. Acts chapter 15, verse 20. Sort of in summary, but that we write to them to abstain from things polluted by idols, from sexual immorality, from things strangled, and from blood. And then again, if we jump down to verse 29, that you abstain from things offered to idols, from blood, from things strangled, from sexual immorality. If you keep yourself from these, you will do well. So that was one of the bigger conclusions. So we can tell this was a problem that wasn't just limited to Corinth specifically. It was a pretty big question among early Christians. What do we make of things offered to idols or food that was offered to idols? And that's also a problem in Revelation chapter 2. In the letters to the seven churches of Asia here, Revelation chapter 2, to Pergamos in verse 14. Revelation 2 and verse 14. But I have a few things against you, because you have there those who hold the doctrine of Balaam, who taught Balak to put a stumbling block before the children of Israel, to eat things sacrificed to idols, and to commit sexual immorality. And it's interesting that, again, we find the practice of idols, idolatry, and sexuality and sexual promiscuity connected. Just like in chapter 6, those two ideas overlap so much in Greco-Roman culture. And then he finishes out Revelation chapter 2. If you're still there in Revelation 2, look at verse 20. Again to Thyatira. Nevertheless, I have a few things against you, because you allow that woman Jezebel, calls herself a prophetess, to teach and seduce my servants to commit sexual immorality and eat things sacrificed to idols. So this is a pretty large problem among first century Christians, and it appears that they had asked Paul for some clarification and understanding about it. Now, we don't have much time to get too deep into the text today, but I will point out, as with my first point up there on the slides, this is another example, as in previous chapters, where Paul could be quoting Corinthian slogans, if you will. And as with previous passages where I suggested this, it is merely a suggested interpretation, and it works both ways. Because a lot of these things, sort of like what we're studying with Job and his three friends, a lot of what his three friends say is true from a certain point of view, or in a certain light, or isolated from Job. It's true statements, but applied to Job, it's wrong. So a lot of these statements, either he's quoting something that the Corinthians had as like a slogan, or something that they maybe wrote to Paul, and he's quoting their words back to him. But also the statements are generic enough that from a different point of view, Paul could be saying something that is otherwise true. So think about that. I would suggest, if you don't have an ESV, read this chapter in your Bible and then read it in ESV, and just see how that maybe alters it slightly, because the English Standard will add some quotations here, and I think that's what's going on. Oh, was that the first or second bell? First bell. Okay. One other fun thing I wanted to point out is this word puffs up. I love when you get words like this. That is an onomatopoeia. What is that? we're doing homeschool with our kids, so I'm going back over like, kindergarten through fourth grade kind of stuff, and I'm remembering, oh yeah, I remember learning that as a kid. It's a word that sounds like what it is. Bam! Pow! So the word puffed up. Fusio. Well, think about, this word is often translated in contemporary Greek as bellows. The thing that you use, like an accordion to get the fire hot. So you're puffing it up. So I just thought that was pretty fun. It's an automatopoeia there. But the idea is that there's this contrast. They could be saying, we know that we have knowledge. Paul, we know better. We know that these idols, they're nothing. There's no God behind them. We know that. So it could be that they're saying, we know this, and Paul's response is, okay, you're right about that. Being right doesn't make you right in all situations, though. Knowledge puffs up, but love edifies, and there could be a bit of a play on words there. If puffs up is the idea of filling with air, knowledge makes you puff yourself up, but love says, I'm going to build somebody else up instead of me. So just think about that. This is, I think, a very profound statement that knowledge makes arrogant. Knowledge puffs up, whereas love edifies. So think about that as the way to interpret. Look at the possible quotes or Corinthian slogans, and then I want you to read 8, 9, and 10 together and just think about what are the main points that Paul is making through these 3 chapters. Bird's eye view. And we'll come back to chapter 8 next week. Thank you.